Some careers are built on talent. Others are shaped by something more complicated, expectation. For decades, Sandra Bullock has stood at the center of a quiet tension that many long-lasting professionals eventually face, the balance between public image and personal identity. Audiences embraced her warmth and authenticity in films like Speed, later seeing a different depth in performances such as The Blind Side and Gravity. But when an audience believes it knows who you are, maintaining that identity can become its own form of pressure. Over time, the real challenge is not simply staying successful, it is deciding how much of yourself the world gets to see. And that question becomes even more complex across decades in the spotlight. So what does her journey reveal about longevity and control? Let's take a closer look together. Following that tension between public identity and private reality, the defining breakthrough in the career of Sandra Bullock arrived at a moment when Hollywood itself was shifting. In the early 1990s, the American film industry was dominated by large-scale action movies built around male stars. Studios relied on familiar formulas. The hero was usually tough, unflappable, and male, while female characters often played supporting roles or romantic interests. It was an era defined by spectacle and speed, but rarely by the presence of a woman at the center of the action. Then came Speed. When the film premiered in 1994, audiences expected the adrenaline of a high-stakes thriller. What many did not expect was the impact of Bullock's performance as Annie Porter, the civilian who unexpectedly finds herself driving a city bus wired to explode if it slows down. On paper, the role might have remained secondary to the film's action. But on screen, Bullock brought something different: nervous humor, quick thinking, and emotional authenticity. Instead of playing the moment as a traditional action hero, she played it as a person thrown into chaos who refuses to collapse under pressure. That subtle shift made the character instantly relatable. Viewers weren't simply watching a spectacle, they were watching someone adapt in real time. The result was a cultural moment. Speed became a major box office success and introduced Bullock to a global audience almost overnight. Suddenly, she was not just another working actor in Hollywood. She was the face audiences remembered when they left the theater. But breakthroughs rarely exist in isolation. What mattered just as much was what happened next. Instead of repeating the same formula, Bullock moved into a very different genre with While You Were Sleeping. The film revealed a completely different dimension of her screen presence. Where Speed showed her navigating chaos, this romantic comedy showed warmth, vulnerability, and emotional timing. It confirmed something studios quickly recognized: Bullock could anchor a film not only through action, but through personality. For Hollywood executives, that versatility translated into reliability. For audiences, it created familiarity. And that combination is powerful. This was the moment success stopped being opportunity and started becoming expectation. From that point forward, every project Bullock accepted carried a different weight. She was no longer proving she could succeed, she was expected to deliver success. For many professionals who have spent decades building their own careers, this stage may feel familiar. Early accomplishments often open doors, but they also quietly raise the standard for everything that follows. Once people associate your name with reliability, the question changes. It is no longer can you do it, it becomes can you keep doing it. Bullock's response to that pressure was strategic rather than reactive. She leaned into the qualities audiences connected with most: humor, relatability, and emotional honesty, while still experimenting with tone and genre. Films like Miss Congeniality later reinforced that balance, blending comedy with the same grounded personality that had first drawn viewers to her. What emerged during this phase was not just a successful actress, but a carefully constructed public identity. Sandra Bullock became someone audiences trusted to deliver a certain kind of experience: entertaining, sincere, and human. But the very strength of that identity would eventually create its own challenge. Because when an audience believes they know exactly who you are, changing that perception becomes the next real test. And that is where the story begins to grow more complicated. In the next chapter, we look at how success brought a new kind of pressure and how Bullock began navigating the expectations that followed. Success brings recognition, but recognition brings something far more complicated: expectation. After the breakthrough success of Sandra Bullock in films like Speed and While You Were Sleeping, the industry and the public began to see her in a very specific way. She was no longer simply a talented actress navigating Hollywood. She had become a brand, an identity audiences believed they understood. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, Bullock was widely viewed as one of the most dependable stars in American cinema. Her films often carried the tone audiences expected: warmth, humor, relatability. Studios valued that consistency because it translated into something rare in the entertainment industry: trust from the audience. When viewers saw her name on a poster, they felt they already knew the emotional experience the film would deliver. But that kind of public perception can quietly reshape a professional identity. The labeled America's sweetheart followed Bullock throughout much of this era. On the surface, it sounded like a compliment. It reflected the qualities that had made her popular: sincerity, kindness, and a sense of emotional openness. Yet labels in Hollywood rarely stay neutral. Once the industry attaches a particular image to a performer, it often begins to shape the roles they are offered. For Bullock, the success of romantic comedies and light-hearted dramas meant she became closely associated with that tone. Films like Miss Congeniality reinforced the idea that she excelled at balancing humor with relatability. Audiences loved it. Studios relied on it. And slowly, the expectations surrounding her career grew stronger. Many Americans who built long careers understand this stage well. After years of dependable performance in a profession, colleagues begin to associate you with a certain role or strength. That reputation becomes valuable, but it can also become limiting. Many Americans who built long careers understand that the qualities that first made them successful can later define them so strongly that change becomes difficult. When a professional identity becomes fixed in the public mind, stepping outside that identity requires careful timing and confidence. For actors, this pressure is amplified by visibility. Every performance reinforces the narrative that audiences already believe. Each successful film strengthens the perception of who the actor is supposed to be. This is how fame begins to shape identity. In Bullock's case, the challenge was not lack of opportunity. She was one of the most successful actresses working in Hollywood. The challenge was maintaining control of her own professional narrative while the industry continued to reinforce a specific version of her image. Some actors respond to that situation by chasing radical reinvention. Others simply continue delivering the roles audiences expect. Bullock chose a more deliberate path. Instead of abandoning the qualities that made her popular, she gradually expanded them. She allowed humor and relatability to remain part of her identity while quietly exploring roles that carried more emotional depth. The goal was not to reject her public image, but to evolve beyond it. This kind of career navigation often becomes more complex as time passes. Early success creates momentum, but longevity requires adaptability. The longer someone remains visible in a profession, the more important it becomes to balance familiarity with growth. For viewers who have spent 20 or 30 years in their own careers, that balancing act may feel very familiar. Over time, the question changes from how do I succeed to how do I remain relevant without losing who I am? And for Sandra Bullock, that question would soon lead to a pivotal shift, one that would redefine how the industry saw her and how she saw herself. Because eventually, maintaining the same identity is no longer enough. Sometimes the only way forward is to reshape it. And that turning point would arrive in a way few people expected. Let's continue the story. When expectations become strong enough, every new project begins to carry a second meaning. It is no longer just about the role, it is about whether the performer will remain inside the identity the public has already assigned. For Sandra Bullock, the years following her early success became a period of careful recalibration rather than dramatic reinvention. By the mid-2000s, Bullock had already achieved something many actors never reach: consistent commercial success across multiple films. Projects like Miss Congeniality reinforced her image as the relatable, humorous lead audiences trusted. But the very strength of that image created a long-term risk. If she continued repeating the same formula, the industry might eventually see her as limited to a narrow range of roles. Instead of resisting her public image outright, Bullock began adjusting her career from behind the scenes. One of the most significant decisions she made was to increase control over the kinds of projects she participated in. Rather than accepting roles solely because they matched audience expectations, she focused on projects that allowed her to influence tone, narrative direction, and character complexity. This strategic shift reflected something deeper than simple career management. It was about autonomy. For actors, autonomy often comes from the ability to choose the right moment to challenge perception. Bullock did not attempt a sudden departure from the persona audiences loved. Instead, she gradually positioned herself in stories that carried greater emotional weight while still maintaining the qualities viewers associated with her. That strategy reached a defining moment with The Blind Side. The film presented Bullock in a role that was both familiar and dramatically deeper. Her character, Lee and Chewie, retained the confidence and wit audiences recognized, but the performance also carried a level of authority and seriousness that critics had not always associated with her earlier work. The result was transformative. Bullock received the Academy Award for Best Actress, a recognition that shifted the industry's perception of her abilities. The Oscar did more than celebrate a single performance, it expanded the professional territory she could occupy moving forward. This was a classic example of long-term positioning. Rather than rejecting the image that made her successful, Bullock used that image as a foundation for something more complex. Audiences who trusted her comedic timing now saw her command dramatic intensity. The transition felt natural rather than forced because it grew from qualities viewers already believed in. Equally important was how she managed visibility. At a time when Hollywood increasingly demanded constant public presence, Bullock avoided oversaturation. She selected projects carefully and maintained a reputation for professionalism rather than publicity. That approach strengthened her professional identity in subtle ways. Instead of being associated with headlines or trends, she became associated with reliability and substance. Studios knew she could anchor major productions. Audiences knew her presence signaled a certain level of quality. This positioning proved particularly powerful in the next phase of her career. When Bullock took on the central role in Gravity, she demonstrated the full extent of the credibility she had built. The film depended heavily on her performance, placing her character at the emotional and physical center of the story. By that point, audiences were prepared to follow her into more serious and demanding material. The trust she had established through years of strategic choices allowed the film to succeed on a global scale. Through these decisions, Bullock protected something many long-lasting professionals struggle to maintain: ownership of their own narrative. Her career did not drift with industry trends. Instead, it evolved through deliberate choices that balanced familiarity with growth. Over time, that balance became the key to her continued relevance in an industry known for constant change. Strategic control can sustain a career for many years, but eventually another challenge emerges: time. In an industry that constantly searches for the next new face, longevity itself becomes a test. For Sandra Bullock, the later stage of her career reflects a different kind of adjustment, one less about proving talent and more about redefining what success looks like after decades in the spotlight. By the time she entered this phase, Bullock had already accomplished what many actors spend their entire careers pursuing. She had led box office hits, earned critical recognition, and secured her place among the most recognizable figures in American cinema. But Hollywood rarely pauses to acknowledge past achievements. The industry continues moving forward, often placing particular pressure on performers as they age, especially women. The question quietly changes. Instead of asking whether an actor can succeed, the conversation begins to focus on whether they can remain relevant. Bullock's response to that reality was notably measured. Rather than trying to maintain the same pace that defined her earlier decades, she gradually reshaped how she participated in the industry. Her appearances became more selective, her projects more deliberate. This shift was not about stepping away from her career, but about controlling the rhythm of it. Aging in the public eye often forces performers to renegotiate their relationship with audiences. Early roles may have relied on youth, energy, or romantic appeal. Over time, those expectations evolve. The challenge becomes finding characters that reflect maturity without diminishing presence. Bullock navigated that transition by choosing roles that emphasized resilience and emotional depth. Her performance in Gravity illustrated this shift clearly. The film placed her character in a situation defined by isolation, endurance, and survival. It was a physically demanding role, but also one that relied heavily on internal strength rather than outward spectacle. The success of the film demonstrated something important about longevity. Audiences are often willing to evolve with performers they trust. Because Bullock had spent years building credibility, viewers were prepared to see her in stories that reflected different stages of life. That trust allowed her to move away from the expectations that had once defined her career. She was no longer required to maintain the tone that had made her famous in the 1990s. Instead, she could explore characters shaped by experience, responsibility, and emotional complexity. This phase of her career reflects a broader pattern that many professionals recognize after decades of work. Early success often revolves around visibility and momentum. Later success depends more on clarity, knowing which opportunities align with one's identity and which do not. Bullock's choices suggest a clear understanding of that distinction. She did not attempt to compete with younger actors for the same kinds of roles. Instead, she embraced a quieter authority that came from experience. The characters she portrayed increasingly reflected individuals navigating difficult circumstances with composure and determination. At the same time, she maintained an important boundary between professional presence and personal exposure. In an era when many public figures feel pressure to remain constantly visible, Bullock allowed distance to become part of her strategy. By appearing less frequently but with greater purpose, she preserved a sense of significance around each project. This recalibration helped sustain her relevance across multiple decades. Rather than chasing attention, she cultivated durability. The result was a career that felt less like a continuous race and more like a long, carefully managed journey. In the end, her later career reveals a subtle but meaningful shift. Success was no longer measured by how often she appeared on screen, but by the freedom to choose how and when she did. Long careers rarely follow a straight line. They move through stages: opportunity, recognition, pressure, adjustment, and eventually something more reflective. The professional journey of Sandra Bullock illustrates that progression in a way that feels familiar to many people who have spent decades building their own lives and careers. Managing success is often more difficult than achieving it. Early recognition can feel energizing, even liberating. Doors open, opportunities multiply, and the future appears wide. But success also carries a quiet responsibility. Once expectations are established, every decision begins to carry weight. The public, the industry, and sometimes even colleagues begin to associate one person with a particular identity. Bullock's career shows how that moment can become a turning point. Rather than allowing success to define her entirely, she learned to manage it. At different stages, she accepted roles that reinforced the qualities audiences loved, while also gradually expanding the range of characters she portrayed. That balance helped her remain recognizable without becoming predictable. For viewers who have spent 20 or 30 years in their own professions, this lesson may feel especially relevant. Early accomplishments can create a reputation that follows someone for decades. Managing that reputation requires patience and self-awareness. It means understanding when to meet expectations and when to quietly challenge them. Equally important is the question of autonomy. In any field, longevity eventually depends on maintaining a degree of personal control. Professionals who remain visible for decades often learn that not every opportunity is worth accepting. The ability to say no becomes just as important as the ability to say yes. Bullock's choices across the years reflect that kind of autonomy. She maintained a presence in major films, including projects like The Blind Side and Gravity, but she also allowed space between projects. That rhythm created distance from the constant demands of the industry and allowed her to approach new work with intention rather than urgency. This approach highlights an important truth about long careers: relevance does not always come from constant activity. Sometimes it comes from restraint. Sustaining relevance over decades requires something deeper than talent or visibility. It requires adaptability without losing identity. Audiences who watched Bullock's early films in the 1990s have grown older alongside her career. Their own lives have changed, careers have matured, families have grown, priorities have shifted. The performers who remain meaningful to those audiences are often the ones whose work evolves in parallel with those changes. Bullock's career reflects that kind of evolution. Over time, the roles she chose began to emphasize resilience, maturity, and inner strength. The tone of her work shifted in ways that mirrored the experiences of the viewers who had followed her for years. That may be the most lasting lesson her story offers. A long career is not defined only by achievement or recognition. It is defined by the ability to grow while remaining authentic, to adjust to changing circumstances without losing the values that shaped the journey in the first place. For anyone who has spent decades building a profession, navigating expectations, and learning when to move forward or step back, that lesson carries real meaning. Sandra Bullock's career reminds us that longevity is not about staying at the center of attention. It is about maintaining control over one's direction while continuing to contribute something meaningful along the way. What part of this story resonates most with your own career journey? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to explore more untold stories about remarkable careers and lasting influence, stay with us as the conversation continues.